Okay, so we're going to do a brief introduction of the series and of, why we're doing this, who it is that's doing it. I'll introduce you, and then I'd like for you to talk a little bit about um, who you are and why you are doing this. Why are you talking about making the transition from homeschool to college?
Okay.
So why don't you give a little bit of content on that,
Okay.
and I'll
Um,
email you all this information as well.
okay. So my name is Phylicia Masonheimer. I'm the homeschool coordinator for Liberty's Office of Admissions. And the reason that I'm talking about the transition from homeschool to college is partially because it's one of my personal passions. I was the oldest of 6 homeschooled children. I didn't know what to do or where to turn when I was graduating high school and didn't have a lot of guidance, nor did my mom when it came to college preparation. So looking back on those years and now as a professional in the higher education field, I've been able to help families who are in the same situation I was in, answering their questions on transfer credit and CLEP testing, the SATs, ACTs, what they need to do to get into college, all of the questions that they have. I'm able to answer those from personal experience and from professional experience as well.
Great. Well, the next thing that I would want to cover in this is to have you give us just a little hint of the things that we will probably be discussing in future conversations before we jump into today's topic, which will be how to start preparing your teenagers as well as yourself as a homeschool mom for making that transition.
So some of the topics that we'll be talking about down the road, Leslie,
Yes.
to the
Yes.
side. So some of the topics that I get a lot of questions about on the road are specifically transfer credit and dual enrollment, as well as CLEP testing. Those 3 topics are my big 3 when it comes to any kind of transfer credit. A lot of homeschool students utilize the community college system, especially for dual enrollment. And now that online education has become so popular and Liberty has a huge online department itself, there's a lot of students that are looking to take online classes as well. So between those 2, you want to be sure that what credits you're taking will actually transfer into the degree you plan to finish. So we'll be talking more in detail about how to determine that, what questions you need to ask, and CLEP testing. Same thing, college level examination program owned by College Board. There's a lot of questions about that as well. We'll probably also get into the spiritual environment of the different colleges you're looking at, because that is something you want to be thinking about as you're looking at different colleges and evaluating them, what kind of discipleship your students will continue to have while they're spending 2 to 4 years on that campus. So there's a lot of questions that result from those topics that will then probably progress into more topics in the future. But those would be a few that we would start with.
That's awesome. Now, with our topic specifically for today, what would you say is the best way to start preparing if you have a student who is college bound or at least open to the idea of being college bound? When should they realistically start preparing, and what would be some of the first steps that they would want to put into practice? For example, I have an 8th grader and a sophomore right now. Both of them are taking some high school level classes for credit. But really, practically speaking, what is the path that one would need to take to prepare for college?
Sure. Well, with homeschoolers are almost always ahead of the game. And most homeschool moms that come up to me and say they think they're behind the cue ball are actually far ahead of where the people who don't homeschool are.
Huh.
And it's no offense to public and private schoolers, but homeschoolers plan ahead. And so a lot of homeschool moms end up being actually quite further ahead than they thought they were. So I'll have moms of 7th and 8th graders come up to me and ask, how do we prepare for college? When most of the time we don't get that question from a public school student until the child is a junior in high school.
Wow.
So, thinking about it from a younger age, from the 8th, 9th, 10th grade level, I think that's a great place to start. It doesn't mean you're behind if you're starting to think about this in 10th grade, whereas, your friend is thinking about it in 8th grade. What really matters is what the student wants to do. And if a student wants to go into a very difficult field, say they want to become a doctor, that's a long-term, educational goal. With something like that, you're going to want to be sure that student has a lot of science and math credits that are really going to prepare them for that level of work in college. They're also going to need some scholarships, so you want to be sure their test scores are high. You're going to need to be working on the SATs and ACTs. So with a student like that, then you might want to start in 8th grade really concentrating on some of those more difficult areas. Now, if there's a student you have who simply wants to study English and become a writer, nothing wrong with that, but they're going to have a different kind of college preparatory program than the one that wants to become a doctor. So you really have to know your child and then think about what curriculum and what steps would best help my child succeed in college. So I usually start by trying to narrow down what they want to study, and then narrowing down what courses or classes they would be taking or encourage them to take. And then after that, start talking about test preparation and how to prepare for the SAT and ACT, since a lot of scholarships are based on that.
Okay, so you mentioned the scholarships are based on the big tests, but just from an entrance, from an admission standpoint, how important really are your test scores, and how much time and effort should be put into preparing for those tests? In our state, in South Carolina, my particular accountability group now requires that either the PSAT, the ACT, or the SAT is taken freshman, sophomore, junior, senior years. We did not know that until right before my oldest took it this year, as we frantically got him. So he really didn't do that well, but he also at that point hadn't had geometry. He had algebra 1 and 2, but he really wasn't prepared. He hadn't had chemistry and biology and those upper level sciences yet. So the fact that he got to practice, I thought was great. His score would not knock anyone's socks off. But how much preparation really does need to go in, and how much emphasis should be put on those test scores?
It really depends on the college you're looking at, but the majority of colleges are going to want a standardized test score. You will hear stories of schools that aren't going to look at them if you have a certain portfolio. Yes, that does happen occasionally, but across the board, a standardized test score is the school's way of knowing how prepared this child is for college level work. It's not that they're trying to be cruel and say, you, even though you're homeschooled, we're going to hold you to this standard. It's more just to get an assessment of what the student's strengths and weaknesses are. So for instance, at Liberty, we do need to have the SAT or ACT unless the student is coming in with an associate degree. So to get an admissions decision and know if you're accepted, you would have to take one of those tests unless you have that associate degree. So for students that are not testing well, or for parents that are looking at those tests up and coming and they're not sure what to expect, actually what you said you did in South Carolina, that's actually an awesome way to prepare a student for those tests. Because like you said, even though he may not have done well on the test, now he knows what to expect. And he knows what it's like. He's experienced that standardized test environment. Whereas a student that, maybe doesn't study or studies a little and then takes the SAT his senior year, if he only takes it once, that's as good as we're ever going to know he could be, when he could have probably done a lot better if he had taken it earlier. So normally what I recommend is have the student take the PSAT the fall of their junior year. So it's their first semester. Junior year is typically when it counts. But you can take the PSAT in 9th and 10th grade if you want to. And a lot of times I do recommend that if the family wants to give it a shot, because then they can kind of look at what their weak areas are and what they can work on in those 2 years, and then take it when it matters. And then when the score comes through, they know, kind of where they're at. That's also the national merit qualifying exam. So a student that does score in the top, I think it's 2%. So it's a really small percentage, but still it's possible. And a lot of homeschoolers are national merit finalists and semifinalists. Wow. At Liberty, that's full tuition. And if they're a finalist, not a semifinalist, it's full tuition, room and board. So big, big scholarship. The PSAT it's a great test to at least try. So say they don't become a national merit finalist, well, now they know what a standardized test is like. So then they take the SAT and the ACT, and if they score higher on one of those, whatever the highest score, that's what we take. And that's across the board. I've sat on a panel with 15 other colleges in the state of Virginia. Every single college said, we don't care how many times you take the test, we take your highest score. So
Oh, great.
they're not going to look down on a student who has to take it a few times.
Right. Now, is there any difference from a college standpoint between the ACT or the SAT? And then I've also heard that for some students, they're just hardwired, I guess, to do better on the ACT or the SAT. So how does that all factor in and weigh out?
That's a good question, and it's true. About a third of students do better on the SAT, a third do better on the ACT, and a third do exactly the same. Essentially, the tests are fundamentally the same in the sense that they're critical thinking tests. They are not information knowledge tests. So it's not about memorizing facts. It's about being able to think through some tricky questions. They're trying to trick you. They want you to overthink it. So a student that's very analytical is going to go into it thinking, I need to really write down, do all the long division on this particular equation, when in fact they could just rule out the wrong answers, and by ruling out the wrong answers, maybe even find the right answer. So there's a lot of college prep test programs that can really help with that. Really, the books made by SAT and ACT are the best since they make the test. The biggest difference between the SAT and the ACT is that the ACT has a science section, the SAT does not. So the SAT is critical reading and math. The ACT would be math, science, and your critical reading or composition English. So we don't look at the essay, and a lot of colleges don't because they have their own admissions essay.
Right.
Fortunately, now it's an optional thing. So between the two tests, they would have a lot of options, a lot of, they would get to choose which one better fits them at that stage of their schooling. I've heard it recommended to take the SAT once they have already done the PSAT. They take the SAT the spring of their junior year, hopefully after they've taken Algebra 1. And then they take the ACT the fall of their senior year, and then the spring of their senior year, they take one or both again.
All right. Well, real quick before we finish up for today, as you're traveling around, I'm sure you talk to a lot of homeschool parents who are just not ready to make this transition. The thought of it is still kind of hard for me, and I have a sophomore. So how do you tell parents is the best way to prepare themselves for making this transition?
Oh, that's a good question, because I do usually deal with the students. I think when it comes to transitioning as a parent, judging from watching my mom. So I'm not a mom yet, 6 weeks, and I
would say very soon.
But at this point, I'm not. So I can only speak from watching my parents. And I think one of the most helpful things that they did, both for us and for them, was gradually teaching us to take ownership of our education and of our future careers. So at 15 and 16 years old, we were highly encouraged to be getting work experience and working outside the home, and getting our driver's license and taking some ownership for those things, saving up money for college. And I think watching us do that from a younger age, that 15, 16-year-old time frame, once I got to 19, which is when I actually went away to college, I did 1 year online, and then I went residentially. It really helped them, I think, feel more secure, knowing I was going to have a job. I was going to be able to handle school, college level work, because I had been doing it. They got a feel for what I was capable of, because they placed responsibilities on me during that period of time, and they got to watch it for 4 or 5 years. And after that, it was, I think, a little easier. I don't think it ever gets easy. I don't think it's ever going to be an easy transition for parents or for students, especially when you're teacher and mom. But at the same time, I think it really encourages the students to realize that this is their decision and that they have to take responsibility and make the most of their education, that it's not something mom isn't teaching them anymore.
Right.
So I think it will always be a little bit hard, but I think starting that transition a little bit earlier, bit by bit, makes it much easier when they actually go away.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. From a personal standpoint, that last bit was really, really encouraging. And it's nice to hear from people the way that you spoke of your mom and what she did. A little bit of mentorship there for those of us who are coming behind is great. So for all of you that are out there, make sure that you join us next time when we will be discussing more homeschool to college tips and secrets and trying to help all of us as we make that transition from homeschool to college. Thanks, Phylicia.